okay, this sounds all very idealistic. It sounds like the right thing to do. It sounds like an important corrective to didactic pedagogy. But what emerges is some quite powerful critiques of progressivism and authentic education. Some of them are just conservative and reactionary. We want to go back to the past because the past was good. But some of them actually have some important insights to them which we as educators need to take note of. So now these critiques emerge in ideas like direct instruction. What direct instruction is, it's a structured, scripted approach to pedagogy. So what we can argue is that curriculum has to be highly structured. The conceptual move through learning grammar, learning algebra, whatever it is that you're doing, involves taking apart the components piece by piece and starting from the simpler, moving to the more complex, logically building one concept on another. And this is a highly systematic process which can't just happen haphazardly by experience and immersion. It's got to be built in a structured kind of way. One of the interesting things, by the way, is that direct instruction was something which really began here at the University of Illinois. It's something where a theorist by the name of Engelmann, who'd been a philosophy student here at the University of Illinois, he got involved in trying to build this highly structured, systematic, step-by-step approach to learning, which became direct instruction. Direct instruction is still huge. Then what happens is later on is as progressivism becomes more and more implemented, there's the whole back to basics movement. Let's not muck around with all this progressivist, child-centered stuff. Let's stick to academic discipline, back to basics, academic standards, and so on. Now, the basis for these arguments are partly around the nature of school or academic learning. So if we just put a bunch of kids in a room, they're not going to be able to figure out science just by experientially mucking around with things. It has to be highly structured. And in fact, what we have in disciplines is we have structured sets of knowledge which are not amenable to completely open, unstructured teaching. So this is one of the arguments, that in the nature of school learning, like the way in which children learn language at home in their early lives, they learn oral language, is quite different from what they need to learn literacy in schools in a structured kind of way. This is the argument that's often made. But also what lies behind these academic disciplines, what lies behind mathematics, what lies behind a systematic understanding of language, for example, it can't be grasped just by experiential learning and just by immersion. That what there is there are generalizations behind it, there are theories behind it, and there's a certain kind of efficiency about speaking directly to those in schools, teaching those as disciplinary structures. And in a way, there's something appropriate about that, given these as structured areas of knowledge, if you like, so that they need to be taught in these kinds of ways. This is one of the arguments, and there's some truth in it. But in fact, one of the very powerful arguments that came up from about the last part of the 20th century on is that, in fact, authentic pedagogy or progressive pedagogy can, if you like, fossilise. It can maintain structures of inequality. So it's on about freedom and equality and all those other nice things, it sounds like, but the effect is to perpetuate inequality. So the simple example is, look, those kids that John Dewey was talking about, he salvaged them from having to do Latin and ancient Greek. He salvaged them from having to do Shakespeare, which they mightn't have understood and they might have found boring and arcane. And he had them do needlework and he had them do woodwork and metalwork, but that was on the assumption that they were going to become housewives or seamstresses, or they were going to become tradespeople at best. Probably they wouldn't even become that. They were going to go into a factory. And the other curriculum, which was Latin and Shakespeare, was for somebody else who was going to become lawyers, because then legal documents, legal judgments were full of Latin phrases, and they're also so. Anyhow, the issue was that you can do something which is very relevant to a child, but when that relevance maps onto inequality, you're actually reproducing inequality. So there's a very powerful argument about that. And one of the theorists of this, an African-American woman by the name of Lisa Delpit, said, look, in fact, these immersive curricula, which have lots and lots of freedom, are fine for middle-class kids who've got heaps of books at home and whose parents speak this funny middle-class kind of talk. But if you come to school and you're an African-American kid and you don't get the logic of this, the rules of the game, the epistemological game, the pedagogical game, the educational game, they've got to be spelled out explicitly. If you're not an insider, they've got to be spelled out explicitly. And in fact, implicit and experiential approaches favour people who are already parts of cultures of privilege. That's her argument. Very powerful argument. There's a lot of truth to it. Now, finally, about progressive education, progressive pedagogy, authentic pedagogy, is just, how widespread was it? Or is it today, for that matter? So if you were to have a rough characterisation of didactic pedagogy and a rough characterisation of authentic or progressive pedagogy, and you will go from classroom to classroom in the world today, in every country of the world, I wonder, this is a rhetorical question, how many of them you would say broadly are didactic versus authentic pedagogy. I'm going to hazard a guess. I'm going to say that the majority of classrooms in the world today, this is all the countries of the world and all the classrooms of the world, would probably be more accurately categorised as didactic pedagogy. That's my guess. I don't know. What do you think? And the other question is, how effective is each pedagogy? The people who do direct instruction swear by the fact it is effective. The kids mightn't like it. It might be authoritarian. It might be this. It might be that. But, it's more effective. It produces those outcomes. Or under what conditions does progressive or authentic pedagogy produce better outcomes for learners? You know what? The answer to these questions is just not clear. Just all the educational research that we've done has not told us what the answer is to these two questions. So this means there are huge questions about the relative value and importance of didactic versus authentic pedagogy. Now, the only thing we do know is that these are very different models of education. The only thing we do know is that we find crazy mixes of them all the time. We might find a mix in one teacher, one lesson, one school, one state, one district. So in other words, what we know is the situation today is one of extraordinary variability. And now, with the rise of technologies in learning, if you were to go through computer-mediated learning environments and you were to roughly classify them as didactic or progressive or come authentic, if you were roughly to divide them into those two categories, there's a hell of a lot of stuff which is just didactic pedagogy that it's been put into a machine. It seems fancy, it seems new, it seems highly innovative, but in fact it isn't that innovative at all. Now, mind you, on the other hand, you might find very engaging, learner-centred, open-ended, interest-laden work in these technology environments as well. You might find stuff that you might map onto progressive or authentic pedagogy. But here's the nice irony. This idea has been around since the 18th century at least. So in a way, a lot of that is nothing new. So we live in this environment of incredible complexity, and the main purpose of my building these analytical distinctions is to give us tools with which to interpret different approaches taken globally, but even to interpret different activity types. You might have different activity types with different approaches even within the same lesson, and you might design the lesson that way.